James Turner, a federal officer, had spent years living in busy cities, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic, endless sirens, and the non-stop rush of people. He had seen enough chaos to last several lifetimes, and when he finally bought a small house in the quiet suburban town of Willow Creek, he imagined mornings filled with the sound of birds, warm sunlight pouring through the windows, and evenings spent reading on his porch without interruption. It was the kind of neighborhood where lawns were perfectly manicured, children played on swings, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves over garden fences. On paper, it was the perfect place to relax and finally enjoy some peace. However, James quickly learned that appearances could be deceiving. Shortly after moving in, a neatly printed letter arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the logo of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. He carefully opened it, expecting perhaps a welcome note or some basic neighborhood rules. Instead, the letter informed him that a special assessment fee had been levied against his property and was due immediately. The amount seemed excessive, and James noticed that he had never agreed to any such fee when purchasing the house. James was no stranger to legal procedures. In his line of work, meticulous documentation and attention to detail were crucial. He calmly photographed the notice, made a copy for his records, and drafted a polite email requesting clarification. A part of him found it odd that such a seemingly peaceful community would enforce fees with such urgency. Yet he reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. He preferred to see evidence before making judgments. The following days brought more letters, each formatted in a professional tone but increasingly insistent. The words "immediate payment required" and "failure to comply" appeared frequently. While some residents might have felt intimidated, James approached the situation methodically. He checked the HOA's official rules, reviewed his purchase agreement, and even called the association's office to request documentation supporting the fee. Each interaction left him more skeptical. The HOA could not provide clear legal justification for the charge, and their explanations often contradicted each other. Even as he focused on paperwork and calls, James began noticing subtle signs around his property. One morning, he found a note tucked under his windshield wiper with a vaguely threatening message about compliance. Another day, a neighbor casually mentioned that the HOA had a reputation for being very strict, and that disputes over fees had caused tension in the past. James appreciated the warning but refused to be intimidated. In his mind, knowledge and preparedness were far stronger than fear. At the same time, James made a point to observe his neighbors without seeming intrusive. Families walked their dogs, children played in yards, and retirees tended to gardens. The neighborhood itself was serene, but James could sense the unspoken rules that governed social life there. The HOA wielded influence quietly, using paperwork, warnings, and subtle pressure to enforce compliance. It was clear that any disagreement with them would require careful strategy rather than impulsive action. Despite the tension, James remained composed. His experience as a federal officer had taught him the value of patience and methodical planning. He set up a detailed file system to track every interaction with the HOA, every letter, and every phone call. He documented dates, times, and the names of any representatives he spoke with. Even as he prepared for the potential of conflict, James also reminded himself to maintain a sense of humor about the situation. After all, it was still just a neighborhood dispute at this point, one that could be handled logically and professionally. As part one of his journey drew to a close, James looked out across his freshly mowed lawn at the quiet street beyond. He felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. Something about the strictness of the HOA and the unexplained fees made him uneasy, but he also recognized an opportunity. If he handled the situation correctly, he could not only protect his rights, but also set a precedent for fairness in the neighborhood. For the first time, James realized that life in Willow Creek would be far more interesting than he had initially imagined. What seemed like a quiet suburban retreat was quickly becoming a stage for a clash of rules, authority, and principle. And James, with his calm determination and legal expertise, was ready to face it head-on. The days following the initial notices were far from quiet. James Turner, still unpacking boxes and adjusting to life in Willow Creek, began noticing a subtle tension that seemed to linger in the air. Every time he checked his mailbox, he found another letter from the HOA. Each one was more insistent than the last, emphasizing compliance and warning of consequences for unpaid fees. Though polite in tone, the letters carried an unmistakable weight, a quiet assertion of authority that seemed to creep into every interaction. James carefully documented every communication. In his experience as a federal officer, even minor discrepancies could reveal larger patterns of mismanagement or oversight. He noticed that the HOA's records often lacked consistency. Some letters cited fees that appeared to duplicate previous charges, while others referenced sections of the HOA regulations that were either vague or misapplied. He made detailed notes, comparing the letters with the official HOA documents he had obtained. Each inconsistency strengthened his resolve. He would not simply pay the fees out of fear or habit. Outside the confines of his own property, life in the neighborhood continued. Children played on the swings and the faint laughter of families drifted through the air. Yet James sensed that the HOA's reach extended beyond paperwork. One afternoon, while trimming the small hedge along his driveway, a neighbor approached him cautiously. "You're new here," the neighbor said. "Just be careful with the HOA. They can be very thorough about rules, and not everyone handles it well." James nodded politely, appreciating the concern. He had expected a quiet, welcoming community, but the subtle warning reminded him that social dynamics could be just as complex as legal disputes. He kept his observations to himself, noting only that neighbors were often hesitant to speak openly, possibly fearing reprisal from the HOA. He also noticed small signs of passive pressure. Neighbors who appeared overly attentive to the rules, cars parked just so, mailboxes aligned perfectly, all seemingly under the HOA's watchful eye. As the week progressed, minor incidents began to accumulate. A small note appeared under the windshield wiper of his car, vaguely worded but unmistakably a reminder to comply promptly. The tone was polite, yet the implication was clear. On another occasion, he found his mailbox slightly ajar, as though someone had been inspecting it. Nothing overtly threatening had occurred, but the subtlety of the gestures left him on alert. James remained calm, documenting everything, understanding that in disputes like these, evidence was more valuable than reaction. Despite these tensions, James did not isolate himself. He continued to engage with neighbors in casual conversation, observing patterns and forming quiet alliances. A few residents shared stories of past disagreements with the HOA, recounting how fees had been contested or fines imposed incorrectly. Others seemed eager to avoid any discussion, walking quickly past his yard or pretending not to notice him. These interactions reinforced what James had suspected. The HOA wielded influence not just through official notices, but through social dynamics that encouraged compliance without confrontation. One evening, while reviewing the week's stack of letters and notes, James realized that the situation was escalating. The HOA seemed to be testing boundaries, measuring his reaction. Where most residents might have quietly paid the fees to avoid conflict, James's methodical approach was met with increased attention. His calm, non-confrontational demeanor may have been mistaken for hesitation, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He decided to take proactive steps. He drafted a clear, concise response to the HOA, requesting formal documentation for each fee, the legal basis for enforcement, and copies of any meeting minutes authorizing special assessments. He also began creating a comprehensive timeline of incidents, from the initial fee notice to the subtle mailbox interference. Each detail was carefully logged, photos attached, and records cross-referenced. By the end of the week, James felt a quiet determination settling in. The first stage of the conflict was no longer just about fees. It was about principle. He understood that the HOA was testing the limits of authority and influence within the neighborhood. Yet he also recognized an opportunity. By remaining calm, organized, and factual, he could navigate the challenge without escalating tensions unnecessarily. As night fell, James looked out from his porch at the quiet street. The houses were still, their interiors illuminated by warm lights, families settling in for the evening. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, but James knew better. Beneath the calm exterior, rules, authority, and unspoken pressures were already at play. And while most residents would follow the path of least resistance, James Turner was prepared to stand firm. In this suburban chess game, he was ready to make his first strategic moves, and he intended to play to win. The following week brought an unexpected turn. James Turner had been meticulously tracking every letter, phone call, and conversation with the HOA, confident that his documentation would support his position. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what awaited. One morning, as he stepped outside to leave for work, he found his vehicle immobilized. A bright yellow notice had been affixed to the windshield, warning that the car was restricted for unpaid assessments and would be towed if moved. James paused, taking a deep breath. He had anticipated disputes over fees, but direct interference with his vehicle crossed a line. Calmly, he photographed the notice, noting the date and time. Rather than reacting impulsively, he contacted the towing company listed on the notice to gather more information. The representative on the phone claimed they were acting under instructions from the HOA, insisting that the immobilization was standard procedure for unpaid fees. James listened quietly, documenting every word. Later that day, he visited the HOA office to request clarification. The staff greeted him politely but were evasive when asked about the legitimacy of the fees. "We follow protocol," one employee said, "and our records indicate that assessments are current." James remained composed, pointing out inconsistencies he had already discovered. Despite the polite tone, it was clear that the HOA was determined to assert authority, testing how far they could push a resident who refused to comply blindly. As word of the incident spread, a few neighbors began speaking to him cautiously. Some offered sympathetic nods, while others seemed wary, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid of being noticed. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Clayton, approached him in hushed tones. "I've seen this happen before," she said. "The HOA can be persistent. Don't let them unsettle you. Document everything. They can't hide behind their own rules if you do." James thanked her, nodding her advice. The subtle support reminded him that even in a controlled environment, quiet alliances could be invaluable. Despite the pressure, James remained methodical. He called a legal advisor to discuss his rights and learned that immobilizing his vehicle without proper legal process could be contested. Armed with this knowledge, he carefully drafted a letter to the HOA, requesting immediate removal of the restriction and copies of the legal documentation authorizing such action. The letter was firm but professional, emphasizing compliance with proper procedures while asserting his rights as a property owner. The HOA responded with a mixture of politeness and insistence. They claimed that fees were overdue and that their actions were standard practice. James noticed subtle contradictions in their statements, indicating a lack of coordination within the board. He made note of these discrepancies, understanding that small inconsistencies could be significant if the dispute escalated further. Meanwhile, tension began to ripple through the neighborhood. Some residents whispered about the situation, others watched curiously from their windows. James realized that the HOA's attempts to assert control were creating a divide. While many residents might have quietly paid the fees to avoid conflict, his refusal, and the methodical way he documented everything, was drawing attention. He was becoming, in a sense, a test case for how far the HOA could push their authority. One afternoon, he noticed a neighbor lingering near his driveway, ostensibly checking on her own car but clearly observing his property. James remained calm, greeting her politely. She hesitated, then quickly walked away. The encounter reinforced his awareness. The HOA's influence extended beyond letters and fees. It shaped how residents interacted and monitored one another. By the end of the week, James had gathered a growing collection of evidence. Photos of the immobilized vehicle, copies of all correspondence, detailed notes on phone calls, and even eyewitness accounts from neighbors who had seen notices being placed. He knew the situation was escalating, and that the HOA might attempt further measures if he did not respond. That evening he stood on his porch looking down the quiet, lamplit street. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, yet beneath the calm surface, a subtle battle of authority was unfolding. Where most residents might have conceded, James felt a sense of purpose. This was no longer just about fees, it was about fairness, due process, and standing up without fear. He realized that patience, careful observation, and methodical action would be his greatest allies. As Part 3 closed, James understood that the conflict with the HOA was entering a new phase. The subtle warnings and minor pressures had escalated into direct interference with his property. He resolved that his response would be precise, measured, and uncompromising in principle. In the quiet of the evening, he prepared for the next steps, knowing that the coming days would test not only his patience, but his ability to assert authority in a world of subtle pressures and hidden rules. The next morning, James Turner awoke to an unsettling sight. His vehicle, which had been immobilized earlier, now bore scratches along the driver's side. The paint was marked in long, deliberate streaks that could not be explained by an accidental brush with a neighboring car or tree branch. James's heart sank for a moment, but he quickly reminded himself to remain calm and methodical. He took photographs from multiple angles, ensuring that every detail was clearly documented. Evidence, he knew, would be crucial if the situation escalated further. He carefully examined the vehicle and noted the damage. It was intentional. The scratches were not random. They followed a consistent pattern, suggesting someone had taken the time to mark the car. James's first instinct was to call the HOA office. He wanted to report the incident, request an explanation, and see whether they would take responsibility. When he reached them, the receptionist offered the usual polite phrasing. "We are sorry this has happened. Accidents occur, and our policies are always followed." James noted the vagueness in their response. "Accidents occur" did not address the deliberate nature of the scratches. He requested documentation showing any legitimate cause for the damage, and as expected, none was provided. The exchange left him frustrated, but more importantly, it reinforced the pattern he had begun to notice. The HOA was willing to escalate, but they were not prepared to be transparent or accountable. Rather than reacting impulsively, James took a broader perspective. He began to compile a detailed record of all incidents: the initial fee notices, the immobilization of his vehicle, the threatening notes, and now the deliberate damage. He organized photographs, letters, and eyewitness accounts in chronological order, creating a file that was both thorough and precise. Every detail mattered, and James knew that careful documentation could transform a confusing dispute into a clear, compelling case. Neighbors, meanwhile, had begun to notice the tension. Some spoke cautiously, sharing stories of past disagreements with the HOA and offering hints of support. Mrs. Clayton, the retired teacher who had spoken to James before, checked in again. "I've seen them push too far," she whispered. "You're doing the right thing by keeping everything documented. People notice who stands firm." Her words reinforced his resolve. Even small gestures of community support reminded him that he was not entirely alone. Despite the unsettling events, James maintained his daily routine. He went to work, returned home, and continued monitoring his property. Each time he walked down the driveway, he looked for any signs of tampering or interference. The scratches on his car, while infuriating, had strengthened his focus rather than diminishing it. He understood that calm, measured action would always be more effective than emotion-driven responses. Late in the week, James decided to escalate his approach strategically. He contacted a legal consultant familiar with homeowner association regulations, seeking advice on how to address property damage and improper enforcement of fees. The consultant confirmed his suspicions. The HOA's actions were not only improper, but potentially actionable if pursued through the proper channels. Armed with this knowledge, James drafted a formal letter to the board, summarizing each incident and requesting immediate corrective action. He requested that the vehicle be returned to full operational status, that the fee notices be reviewed for legality, and that any future actions comply strictly with proper procedure. James also prepared for the possibility of further retaliation. He set up discrete cameras around his driveway and noted the time-stamped positions of his vehicle. By creating a clear, observable record, he ensured that any future interference would be captured in real time. Even as he implemented these measures, he remained calm and professional. The goal was not revenge. It was fairness, clarity, and accountability. That evening, James stood on his porch looking out at the quiet street once again. The scratches on his car were a stark reminder that the HOA would not hesitate to push boundaries. Yet he felt no fear, only determination. The conflict had escalated beyond letters and warnings. It now involved tangible interference with his property. But James knew he had the advantage of preparation, patience, and methodical strategy. As Part 4 concluded, James understood the stakes clearly. The HOA's actions were deliberate, but they also exposed patterns of overreach that he could document and challenge. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer a simple disagreement over fees. It was a test of authority, principle, and resolve. And James Turner, with his experience, calm demeanor, and strategic mind, was ready to meet that challenge head-on. After the incident with his vehicle, James Turner knew it was time to take a more proactive approach. The scratches and immobilization had crossed a line, and while he had responded calmly, he realized that patience alone would not resolve the ongoing conflict with the HOA. The situation demanded careful investigation and a strategic plan. Drawing on years of experience as a federal officer, James began analyzing the HOA's practices systematically. He started by reviewing every notice, fee assessment, and official communication he had received since moving in. Each document was scrutinized for inconsistencies, improper wording, and unsupported claims. James noticed subtle discrepancies. Some fees referenced non-existent rules, while other notices cited outdated or incorrectly numbered sections of the HOA regulations. Even more concerning, certain notices contradicted previous communications, suggesting a lack of proper oversight or coordination within the HOA board. To strengthen his position, James reached out to neighbors quietly. He discovered that some had experienced similar frustrations: unexplained fees, sudden inspections, and strict enforcement of rules that seemed inconsistently applied. While many residents had quietly to avoid conflict, a few were willing to share their experiences. James documented these accounts carefully, treating them as observations rather than accusations, preserving the neutrality and credibility of his investigation. Next, he turned his attention to physical evidence. The scratches on his car, the immobilization notice, and the suspicious notes were cataloged meticulously. James photographed each item with multiple angles, recorded the date and time, and stored the images in a secure digital folder. He even set up discrete cameras around his driveway to capture any further incidents, knowing that real-time documentation could prove invaluable if the dispute escalated legally. James also reviewed the HOA's bylaws and meeting minutes, many of which were available publicly or could be requested formally. As he read through the documents, he noticed procedural irregularities. Fees were often approved without proper board votes, certain rules were applied inconsistently, and communication to homeowners was vague or incomplete. These findings painted a pattern of administrative mismanagement, reinforcing his belief that the HOA's actions were not just overzealous but potentially improper. While conducting his investigation, James maintained his routine to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. He continued working his shifts, tending to his property and interacting with neighbors politely. At the same time, he observed subtle signs of the HOA monitoring him. Letters still arrived, some more insistent than before, and a few neighbors appeared unusually attentive to his comings and goings. James documented all of this without confrontation, understanding that keeping detailed records would strengthen his position if the conflict progressed. Midway through the week, James compiled his findings into a clear, organized report. It included a timeline of incidents, photographs, copies of letters, and notes from conversations with neighbors. Each section highlighted discrepancies and irregularities in the HOA's enforcement of fees and rules. James's goal was not confrontation, but clarity. He wanted to demonstrate the pattern of overreach and administrative mismanagement in a factual, undeniable way. Armed with this evidence, James began considering his next steps. He understood that the HOA might attempt further measures if they sensed he was building a case. Preparation, he knew, was essential. He drafted potential letters, planned formal requests for board meetings, and prepared a strategy to escalate matters legally if necessary. James also began consulting with a legal advisor experienced in homeowner association disputes, ensuring that each move he made would be supported by law and procedure. By the end of the week, James felt a growing sense of control. The conflict was no longer a series of random annoyances. It was a structured challenge that could be addressed with careful investigation and methodical action. He had turned his frustration into preparation, and the evidence he collected gave him confidence that the HOA's overreach could be addressed effectively. As Part 5 closed, James looked out over his quiet street, the sun setting behind neatly aligned homes. While most residents went about their evenings unaware of the brewing conflict, he felt a sense of purpose and readiness. The HOA's actions had created tension, but they had also revealed weaknesses that could be leveraged with strategy and patience. James knew the next phase of the battle would require direct engagement, but for now, he had laid the foundation, a clear, documented case built on facts, observation, and careful preparation. He was ready to move forward, confident that calm determination and knowledge would guide him through the challenges ahead. After several weeks of careful investigation, James Turner felt prepared to confront the HOA directly. The pattern of overreach, the repeated interference with his property, and the inconsistencies in their fees had become too significant to ignore. What had started as minor disputes over paperwork and notices had escalated into a situation that required direct engagement. James scheduled a formal meeting with the board, ensuring he had copies of all documentation, photographs, and records neatly organized. He also consulted with his legal advisor, confirming that his approach was both professional and supported by law. The day of the meeting arrived. James entered the HOA office calmly, carrying a thick folder that contained the full timeline of events. The board members were present, seated around a polished table. Their expressions ranged from polite curiosity to subtle defensiveness, and James immediately noticed the quiet tension in the room. This was the moment where preparation and calm authority would be tested. James began by introducing himself and briefly summarizing his experience as a federal officer. He explained that his goal was not to escalate conflict, but to seek clarity, fairness, and proper adherence to established rules. He then presented his documentation, every letter, every note left on his car, photographs of the scratches, and records of phone conversations. Each piece was displayed calmly and factually, leaving no room for subjective interpretation. The board members exchanged glances. One attempted to downplay the evidence, insisting that all actions taken were routine enforcement of HOA policies. James countered, pointing out the inconsistencies. Fees that were applied without proper board approval, immobilization of his vehicle without legal authorization, and repeated interference with his property. He spoke in a firm but measured tone, emphasizing that his objective was resolution through proper procedure rather than confrontation. As the meeting continued, a few neighbors who had attended the session to observe quietly began to whisper among themselves. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The HOA board realized that the conflict was not isolated. James's meticulous presentation, combined with the growing awareness among residents, created an environment where the board could no longer dismiss the issues casually. One board member, attempting to regain control, challenged James. "Are you suggesting that our actions were improper?" he asked, his tone defensive. James responded evenly, "I am suggesting that the actions taken, including fees and property interference, were not fully supported by documentation or proper procedure. My intent is to clarify these issues and ensure fair enforcement going forward." The calm confidence in his voice left little room for argument. Throughout the confrontation, James remained composed. He noticed subtle signs of unease, shuffled papers, a few nervous glances, and moments of silence where explanations faltered. He documented these reactions mentally, noting that the board's credibility was weakening under scrutiny. His methodical approach, patience, and clear presentation of facts were beginning to turn the tide in his favor. By the end of the meeting, the HOA had been forced to acknowledge gaps in their processes. They agreed to review the unauthorized fees, retract any actions taken without proper authority, and provide written assurances regarding property interference. James emphasized that any future measures must comply with established rules and legal procedures. The board, while reluctant, had little choice but to agree. After leaving the office, James walked through the neighborhood with a quiet sense of satisfaction. While the conflict was far from over, this confrontation had demonstrated the power of preparation, patience, and calm authority. Neighbors who had observed or heard about the meeting began to recognize his determination, some quietly offering words of support. The atmosphere in the community had begun to shift subtly. The HOA could no longer rely solely on intimidation and selective enforcement. As Part 6 concluded, James understood that the battle had moved into a new phase. The HOA had been confronted with undeniable evidence, and the initial victory lay in clarifying the rules and asserting proper procedure. Yet he knew that continued vigilance would be necessary. This confrontation had been an important turning point, showing that standing firm with facts, strategy, and professionalism could challenge authority and bring fairness into focus. James returned to his home, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. The confrontation had set the stage for the next steps, ensuring accountability, monitoring compliance, and solidifying the support of the community. He knew that the HOA might attempt further maneuvers, but he was ready. The quiet street no longer seemed entirely serene. It was a stage for accountability and principle, and James was prepared to see the conflict through to resolution. After the confrontation with the HOA board, James Turner felt a quiet sense of progress. The board had been forced to acknowledge the inconsistencies in their actions, but he knew that acknowledgement alone would not guarantee lasting change. He needed to ensure that accountability was maintained, that the fees were corrected, and that residents were aware of proper procedures. The next stage required patience, strategy, and careful observation. James began by following up with formal letters summarizing the meeting. He included clear requests, the removal of any improperly assessed fees, the reversal of penalties associated with his immobilized vehicle, and assurances that future actions would follow proper procedure. Each letter was composed professionally, calmly, and precisely, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Copies were shared with legal counsel to ensure that his actions remained fully supported. Within a few days, responses began arriving. The HOA board seemed cautious now, their previous confidence replaced by hesitation. Some members acknowledged errors in record-keeping, while others provided incomplete explanations that James noted carefully. Each response was meticulously documented, and every inconsistency added to the growing body of evidence that supported his position. Meanwhile, neighbors began to take notice. Rumors of the confrontation and the board's faltering responses spread quietly through the neighborhood. Residents who had previously avoided involvement now approached James cautiously, seeking advice or simply sharing their own experiences. He listened politely, encouraged transparency, and reassured them that his goal was fairness and clarity rather than conflict. Slowly, he realized that his calm and methodical approach had begun to inspire confidence. People were beginning to see that standing up for proper procedure was both possible and effective. As the HOA continued to respond, James discovered more procedural oversights. Certain fees had been levied without proper board approval, notices had been sent without clear documentation, and records of votes on special assessments were incomplete or missing entirely. The inconsistencies painted a pattern of administrative mismanagement, and James compiled the new findings into a comprehensive report, ready for further action if necessary. In addition to documentation, James decided to use subtle observation as a tool. He discreetly monitored meetings and interactions, noting how the board responded when residents asked questions or raised concerns. Their reactions confirmed what he had suspected. The board's authority relied heavily on compliance and intimidation rather than transparency and proper procedure. Each observation strengthened his understanding of how to navigate future challenges while protecting his rights and interests. The turning point arrived one afternoon when the HOA called a follow-up meeting. James attended with his documentation neatly organized, accompanied by a few neighbors who had quietly expressed support. The mood in the room was markedly different from their first encounter. The board members were cautious, aware that their actions were under scrutiny and that James had prepared thoroughly. For the first time, their confidence faltered in the face of well-documented facts and composed authority. During the meeting, James presented his findings systematically. He highlighted each procedural error, documented instance of improper enforcement, and confirmed how previous actions had impacted not only him but potentially other residents. The board struggled to respond, their explanations often inconsistent or incomplete. By the end of the session, they agreed to review and reverse improper assessments, correct records, and ensure that future actions fully with established regulations. Walking home afterward, James felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The conflict had reached a stage where the HOA's influence was constrained, their authority questioned, and their actions made transparent. The neighborhood itself seemed to shift subtly in response. Residents who had previously been hesitant now watched the situation with renewed awareness, understanding that accountability was possible when approached methodically and professionally. As Part 7 closed, James Turner reflected on the journey. The confrontation had revealed not only the HOA's weaknesses, but also the power of patience, documentation, and calm authority. He had transformed what initially seemed like a frustrating conflict into an opportunity for clarity, fairness, and community awareness. The battle was far from over, but the turning point had been reached. The HOA was no longer able to act unchecked, and James's approach had inspired both compliance and quiet admiration from the community. James looked out over his street as evening settled in. The houses were still, the lawns neatly kept, and the neighborhood appeared peaceful once more. Yet beneath the calm surface, subtle changes were. The balance of authority had shifted, and the stage was set for the final resolution, a moment when fairness, clarity, and principle would fully prevail. The final chapter of James Turner's struggle with the HOA began with a renewed sense of purpose. After weeks of careful documentation, investigation, and direct confrontation, the board had been forced to acknowledge their procedural errors. Yet James knew that acknowledgement alone was not enough. Accountability had to be established and enforced to ensure the neighborhood would not return to the same patterns of confusion and overreach. James began by sending a formal letter summarizing all prior incidents and outcomes. It was precise, professional, and thorough. Each section referenced dates, photographs, and documented interactions with the HOA. He requested confirmation that all improperly levied fees had been removed, that any property interference would be reversed, and that the board would adhere to correct procedures in the future. Copies were sent to legal counsel, ensuring that every step was backed by the proper legal framework. The HOA responded with caution. This time, the tone was noticeably different, more cooperative and less authoritative. They acknowledged errors in record-keeping, agreed to reverse all improperly applied fees, and confirmed that the immobilization and damage to James's vehicle would be rectified. Written assurances were provided, reinforcing that future enforcement would comply strictly with HOA bylaws and state regulations. For James, the response marked a significant milestone. The board, once confident and insistent, was now acting within the bounds of fairness and accountability. James also took steps to restore his property. His vehicle was repaired at the HOA's expense, the scratches fully removed, and the immobilization notice retracted. While the physical damages had been an inconvenience, the resolution carried a larger significance. It symbolized the power of methodical preparation and calm authority. It was a tangible reminder that adherence to procedure and documentation could prevent abuse of authority and ensure fairness. As the news of the HOA's concessions spread, neighbors began to emerge from their quiet observation. Those who had experienced similar issues felt a sense of validation. A few approached James, expressing gratitude for his patience and determination. His calm and professional handling of the situation had not only protected his rights, but also inspired others to recognize that fairness and accountability could be achieved without confrontation or hostility. The neighborhood itself began to feel more balanced. The subtle tension that had previously lingered in the air started to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of reassurance. With the HOA now held accountable, James focused on establishing long-term safeguards. He recommended that the board implement clearer communication protocols, maintain accurate records of all assessments and votes, and provide transparent documentation to residents. He also suggested routine reviews to ensure that actions were consistently applied according to established rules. While some board members were initially hesitant, the evidence and prior outcomes encouraged them to adopt these measures. Over time, the community began to embrace a new culture of transparency and accountability. James's experience had taught him more than the intricacies of HOA governance. It had reinforced the value of preparation, patience, and strategic action. By maintaining calm authority, documenting every detail, and approaching the conflict methodically, he had transformed a challenging situation into a positive outcome. The neighborhood, once quietly tense under the weight of strict enforcement and unclear rules, now enjoyed a renewed sense of trust and clarity. In the evenings, James would step onto his porch, watching the neighborhood as the sun set behind the neatly lined houses. The lawns glowed warmly in the fatting light, children played without fear of arbitrary enforcement, and neighbors exchanged greetings freely. The HOA, now operating within clearly defined rules, no longer cast a shadow of uncertainty over daily life. For James, it was more than a victory over improper fees. It was proof that fairness and patience could prevail even against seemingly unyielding authority. As the story concluded, James reflected on the journey. The conflict had begun with a single disputed fee and escalated into a test of principle, strategy, and perseverance. Along the way, he had faced intimidation, interference, and uncertainty, yet he had navigated each challenge with calm professionalism. The neighborhood had witnessed the process, learning that standing firm with facts, preparation, and integrity could create lasting change. The quiet street of Willow Creek returned to its peaceful rhythm. Lawns were maintained, mailboxes aligned, and vehicles parked without fear of unexpected restrictions. For James Turner, the resolution was not just about the HOA or the fees. It was a testament to the power of principle, preparation, and measured action. He had defended his rights, restored his property, and helped guide his community toward transparency and fairness. And in that calm, orderly neighborhood, he finally felt the peace he had sought when he first arrived. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.